Welcome to Bandit's Keep. I'm Daniel. In this video, we're going to talk about weapons versus armor and why I think it makes combat more interesting and fighter type classes a lot cooler. So I've been using original Dungeons & Dragons for a while now. Over a year, I've been using it for my home campaign with the chainmail combat system. So let me do a little bit of history just so we know where we're at. So when Dungeons & Dragons was first released in 1974, I did not play it then. I was an infant. The suggested combat system was another game, right? People often joke about that, called Chainmail, which was a war game. Chainmail has big mass combat rules. It has rules for fighting dragons like in a fantasy thing. And then it also has what's called man-to-man combat. Man-to-man combat is effectively weapon versus armor. My sword versus your plate mail, my mace versus your chainmail armor. You fight in a smaller scale of what they call skirmish for war gamers out there. You can tell I'm not a war gamer because I'm saying what they call a skirmish. This system is really interesting. And what it does is it changes the perspective of what a fighter can do, because fighters, as one of their main abilities, can use any weapon and any armor. So let's take a quick look at a chart here that I have on my iPad. This is my own kind of recreation of the chart from Chainmail. I will put the link to Chainmail in the show notes. I will also put a link to this chart. So if you want to download it, you kind of want to have Chainmail to understand it all, but I'll go through it a little bit here. So we're looking at this, and what you can see here is on the left, we have all our various weapons. I added unarmed to the top. Across the top, we have at the very top, we have our troop type. Don't worry about that. Below that, though, we have our various armors and armor classes. So for instance, armor class 5 is chainmail armor, just like it is now, right? Armor class 5, chainmail, when you're attacking it with a dagger, you need a 9 to hit. And you might say, a 9? That's really easy. These charts are based on 2d6. Taylor over at Clerics Wear Ringmail is converting this to a d20 roll. So I'll put a link to their blog there so you can follow that and get the d20s if you want to use that system instead. I like the bell curve, or it's not really a bell curve, but I like the curve of a d6, so I use this system, but you can definitely use a d20 system for this. It doesn't line up exactly, obviously, because d20 is in 5% increments and 2d6 is kind of a weird range, but it works. Anyways, what we look at here is we choose our weapon, battle axe versus plate mail armor, 9. Battle axe versus plate and shield, 10. Morning star versus studded, 6. Polearm versus leather, 6. Okay, and we can see that we just reference the weapons that's being used against the armor that the person's wearing, and that's how we get our 2 hit. And you might say, okay, but what about level and all these other things? This is one reason why I like this system. You see, in BX, and actually even in OD&D, in what they call the alternate combat system, which is the D20 system, for levels 1 through 3, everybody has the same attack. That is to say that your magic user and your fighter, assuming there's no bonuses for strength or whatever, need the same number to hit that goblin, no matter what weapon they're using, no matter that they're 2 different classes, and that's always rubbed me the wrong way. And this is something that I really like about this system, because now your magic user's restriction of only being able to use a dagger makes more sense. It's a game balance thing. The magic user's not going to be as effective in combat because they can't wear armor, which means there's always going to be no armor, and they can only use a dagger. So a dagger against your plate mail is a 12 to hit on 2d6, which is like a 3% chance, right? So this magic user is definitely not the one to go up against a knight with their dagger, at least not on first level. But Daniel, you didn't answer the question. Right. Let's take a look at OD&D for a second. Okay, this is Book 1, Men and Magic, and I'm looking at the classes. We have Fighting Men. You've probably heard before that it was called Fighting Men before they changed it to Fighter. And we have our various levels with the level titles. And we can notice when across we see something called Fighting Capability. The number of men that you fight as is effectively the number of attacks that you make on the chart. That is to say, if we look at the magic user below them, on first level, the magic user fights as man. They get 1 attack. The fighter fights as man +1. They get 1 attack and they add 1 to it, so they're better. At second level, the magic user makes 1 attack and adds 1 to it. The fighter gets 2 attacks and can add 1 to one of those attacks. Third level, magic user finally gets 2 attacks. Fighter gets 3 attacks. Fourth level, fighter's getting 4 attacks, where the magic user is getting just 2 + 1. So we can see that the fighter's always getting more attacks. And that's going to make them more powerful. Now, these things aren't just attacks. Let's look back at the table. Okay, so this is the main table here, but when you go to the next page, we can see first strike, counter blow, and parry by weapon class. Okay, and you also have your missile weapons above this. Every attack, if you will, or every man, or however you want to look at it, that a person gets gives them one move, if you will, in combat that round. That is to say that if a fighter fights as 3 men, they can make 3 attacks. But depending on their weapon length, they might make an attack and a parry, which we'll talk about in a second. Or they could switch weapons, which I found to be a great tactic. That is to say that if you walk down the dungeon corridor, you may want to use a spear or a polearm, a pike or something like that in front of you so that you have a long weapon, because in combat, the initial engagement, when units first clash, if you have a weapon that's 2 classes bigger than the opponent, you automatically go first. So let's go back again. A spear is weapon class 8. Most of your dungeon people, right, your orcs are gonna have battle axes, maybe your kobolds are gonna have daggers or hand axes, your maces maybe, your goblins are gonna have swords. These are all short-ish weapons. Now, it is true, a goblin might have a spear, and then that's a whole other thing, right? But chances are, if you have a spear, then you're going to get the first attack. That is super important, right? Once they close and you take those first attacks, the next round, anybody with a weapon class 2 or less, then so the shorter weapon automatically goes first. But a fighter with multiple levels or multiple moves, if you will, can do something like my 3rd level fighter can. There's 4 goblins charging at. I will attack the goblins twice, then I'll switch to my mace for the next round. So I get 2 attacks before they get to go. I switch to my mace, then they attack me, any of them that are still up anyways. The next round, we have close to the same weapon class, so we're going to roll initiative, which is just a d6. This can create a very dynamic fight. The other thing you can do is you're fighting off the goblins in leather armor with your sword, let's say, which needs an 8 to hit leather armor, and then the hobgoblin king comes out to fight you, and they're wearing a full suit of plate. You sheathe your sword and pull out your mace, because a sword against plate needs a 10, but a mace against plate only needs a 7. This creates a situation where the fighter's capability of using all different weapons matters. The cleric can't use a spear, so they can't take advantage of that first initiative thing, but they get, obviously, a good attack against plate mail if they have a mace, but the fighter can do both. So not only do the fighters get more attacks and more moves, they have more options. This makes any fighter type class more powerful. That would include, obviously, the elf, the halfling, and the dwarf. Now, dwarves can't use like 2-handed swords, which are very powerful in this, or very long weapons, nor can halflings. So, the demi-humans have that advantage that we've talked about before, but in the elf obviously can do anything, but the elf requires tons and tons of experience points. So it does make the human fighter a little bit more versatile than some of the other classes. Is a dwarf probably still a better fighter than a fighter? Yeah, but all of them are better than clerics and magic users when you use a system like this. I don't want to go deeply into it, but I just want to, for anybody that really likes tactics and these kind of things, some of this stuff can be really interesting. So let me just quickly show you how the first strike works. As I said, when you first engage, anyone with a weapon that is 2 classes or more higher goes first automatically. After that first clash, having a weapon that's 2 classes shorter will allow you to automatically go first. If you're somewhere in the middle, you roll initiative. Now, that's not all it does. If we look at our first strike chart here, we can see parries. Now, what a parry does is you use one of your moves or one of your attacks. So if you have 3, your 3rd level, you could choose to parry 1 time. The parry subtracts 2 from the attack roll against you. Depending on the weapon class, you might get a counter blow if the parry works. That is to say that if somebody needed a 7 to hit me and I parry so they need a 9, and then they roll an 8, I'll get to attack them back. Again, it depends on the weapon length, and you just quickly look at it. So we can look at some really cool combinations here too, where like 8 classes or lower. So you're using like a dagger against somebody with a pike, right? The guy with the pike's going to jam you with the pike before you can get in close. But if you survive that and you get up close with that dagger magic user, you're going to get first blow, and you could parry another blow if you want, or a second blow. So you might be able to stab them twice and take them out before they get to attack you again. It adds strategy to combat, which I think is very cool. Now, if you are running BX or OSE, if you don't know what those are, I'll have links in the description. There's a few changes that you're going to need to make. Number 1, you're going to obviously have to use that fighting capability chart. You can get that information from Men in Magic. It has the fighters, which would be all the demi-humans as well, the clerics and the magic users. If you want the thief, you'll need Greyhawk supplement, although I believe the thief is almost identical to the magic user, so you could probably just use magic user, and that will give you that. Because without that, this doesn't change much, right? It adds some flavor, but it doesn't really change it. The other thing to consider is that if you're going to use it the way that I use it with 2d6, you've got to modify the attack bonuses that you get for strength and dexterity in BX, because you can get up to +3, and +3 on a 2d6 roll is huge. So don't use that. Change it a little bit to make it work for your table, or check out Taylor over at Clerics Wear Ringmail, who, like I said, is doing a D20 hack for it so that those numbers will actually line up better. All that being said, I've been using this for well over a year at my home table. I've dropped brand new people who have never played before into the system, and they've played it no problem. It's not that complicated. In fact, on some level, it's easier because your armor is always your armor. So in some systems, especially when you have lots of bonuses, like let's say BX, if you're a fighter and you have plate and shield, you're armor class 2, right? But if you have an 18 dexterity, you're armor class -1. How would that work on this chart? Well, basically, you would be armor class 2. And then what happens is they subtract from their attack roll 3. Easy as that. Armor is always armor. If you don't know where something should sit, like let's say you're fighting a giant scorpion and it has armor class 5, it's like, where would that be? Well, you can just look. Armor class 5 is chainmail armor. Look under chainmail, it'll work. It's not always perfect, but I found it works really well. I do it on the fly with monsters all the time, and it's pretty easy to do. You just look at their armor class and you decide what their, in the case of a giant scorpion, maybe their tail is like a two-handed sword or a pike, probably more like a pike, right? And you can go from there. Their claws might be battle axes, and you would just figure that out and you'd go from there. Super easy, super fun. I would love to know if you guys use anything like this, or do you use the one from AD&D? Because there is the one at AD&D, which we also used when we were kids. This, I think, is cleaner. I think it works really well. And yeah, if you want to know more about this kind of stuff, my podcast talks a lot about using original Dungeons & Dragons and chainmail. When I discovered this system, it really changed the way I thought about D&D. It changed the way fighters felt. It changed the way the whole system felt to me. It raises the level of heroism, I guess maybe is the right word, but also keeps it simple and deadly at the low levels, just like BX and OSE. If you haven't already, go ahead and like the video if you like it. Subscribe to the channel. I would love to have more subscribers. Also check the notes below. I'll put a link to this chart that I made, a link to chainmail, a link to OD&D, a link to the other stuff I talked about, Clerics Wear Ringmail. You'll also find a link to my Discord server. You can join up over there and talk about this or other things, obviously. And there's also a link to my Patreon if you want to support the channel. That would be amazing. I'll talk to you soon.